Good evening. How's everybody doing? Let's light up the darkness. Such cognitive dissonance, right? I'm playing that recording that we're working our way through of our Hallel. So joyous on Hoshana Rabbah. That was the day before. That was October 6th. And ever since, with God's help, we'll feel that joy again. And thank God we're doing what we can right now, right? We're serving in the Torah learning division of the security forces of Israel, and we're going to stand our post and learn as best we can and concentrate. And we're going to, and we should all be reciting Tehillim, Psalms 121, 130 are especially good. We're going to share a link just a little later, probably tomorrow or tonight. Many Steinsaltz, Rav Steinsaltz's son, he's got a fund set up to help families that he personally knows, right? That they have husbands and wives, moms and dads who are off fighting the war, and their families really need the help. So I know many Steinsaltz personally. He knows these families personally. And all of the funds will go where it is most needed. And that'll be a way for us to donate. So let's get on with it. Today we welcome in the house Yehudit in South Carolina, Stephen in New Hampshire, Paula in Chicago, David in Indiana, Bill in mid-Missouri, Jonathan in Thousand Oaks, Lucy in Minnesota, and it skipped. Mike in Delaware, Bella in Florida, Guy in Ohio, Belle in Texas, Melissa in Great Neck, Joe in the Inland Empire, Tom in PA, Paul in the Great Northwest, and Ella says shalom. Welcome, everybody. Our daf today is page 63, Samech Gimel. We're in chapter 3. Today we'll complete our discussion of Mishnah number 5, and we'll open a couple more Mishnahs. So Mishnah number 5 was with regard to this man who said, to this woman, okay, become betrothed to me. And he's going to give her some item of symbolic value, the peruta. But he's also adding the condition, it's probably a condition she said, or a condition that was part of their betrothal. I'm sorry, this is the one about assumptions, right? He betroths her because he thought that she was the daughter of a priest or that she was the daughter of a Levite. And then he learned that she wasn't. Okay, so that was his own assumption. And the betrothal is a betrothal. We don't allow him to retract based on his own assumption. Okay, so what we were talking about pertaining to that discussion is whether a person can make a disposition, make a vow about, or make a betrothal contingent on something that does not yet exist, right? So for example, can I sell you the dates that will grow on this palm tree? That probably does work. Can I sell you the dates that will grow on a palm tree that I'm going to plant? And when it grows and starts producing dates, then those dates will become yours based on the money you pay me today. Much more difficult transaction for it to have legal validity, because you're trying to make a purchase and sale, or you're trying to make a betrothal based on something that doesn't exist yet. And the sages disagree quite a bit about trying to make a disposition regarding things that are not available yet or don't even exist yet, right? So yesterday we were talking at the end of the day about a person who intends to purchase a slave in order to free him. And so he says that you are free from now after I purchase you. I'm going to purchase you, and then I'm going to free you, and you will be free retroactively from now. So that's going to work. And so because it's going to work, as soon as he makes the purchase, that slave is free, and he's never delivered to this person for him to personally free the slave, because the slave's freedom is retroactive to when the man made this oath or this promise. So in discussing this, Rabbi Meir, so we picked this up right near the top of 63a, Rabbi Meir also holds that one can transfer an entity that has not yet come into the world, as it is taught in a baraisa with regard to one who says to a woman, you are hereby betrothed to me after I convert, or after you convert, or after I am emancipated. This was the previous Mishna. That's why I thought, I forgot that we got to the next Mishna, but now we're referring back to the Mishna before last, or the Mishna before the one we're discussing, right? So this idea that you could be betrothed to me after I convert, or after you convert, right? Now, a Jew cannot betroth himself, under Jewish law to a non-Jew, right? And it doesn't work either way, whichever one, the man or the woman, it doesn't work. So can you make this betrothal that's going to take effect after the conversion takes place? And one thing we talked about in that discussion is, well, whether the person has control over it or not. It seems like the guy says, after I convert, well, he can convert at any time. Then we said, well, yeah, but it's not any time, because he's going to have to get a based in, of 3 halakhic authorities for him to stand in front of, to act as his rabbinic court that tells him he's going to become obligated in the commandments, etc. So he doesn't have full control over it. So what does it say in this baraisa that was based on the same idea with regard to one who says to a woman, you are hereby betrothed to me after I convert, or after you convert, or after I am emancipated if he's a slave now, or after you are emancipated if she is a slave now, or after your husband dies if she is a married woman, or after your sister dies if a man is saying, to his wife's sister that, after my wife dies, I'm going to marry you. Right? So, can he say that? Because he can't marry his sister-in-law while his wife is still alive, even if he divorces her. But after his wife dies, then he could marry her sister. Or even after your yavam performs halitza with you, right? So a woman who is a widow, but she, her husband left a brother and no children, so she has this levered obligation to that brother-in-law, and she can't marry anyone else until she performs halitza with that brother-in-law, or marries him and then, divorces him. Until then, she can't marry anyone else. So can we create this betrothal that would require one of these conditions to be realized before the betrothal would even be legally possible? And Rabbi Meir, so the baraisa, like the Mishna, says no. You can't say, I will be betrothed to me after I convert, or after you convert, etc. That betrothal is not a betrothal. The baraisa says the same thing. But Rabbi Meir disagrees, and he says, yes, she is betrothed. You can make these betrothals that will only take effect after the condition is met, which currently renders the betrothal legally impossible. Rabbi Yochanan Hassanler says she is not betrothed, right? That's where we left off yesterday. So Rabbi Yehuda Nasi says that in some of these cases, by Torah law, she is betrothed, right? Rebbe's taking this middle ground. The Brisa says in none of those cases. Rabbi Meir says in all of those cases the betrothal does work. Rebbe says in some of the cases. By Torah law, she is betrothed, meaning by rabbinic law, we're not going to allow it, but by Torah law, it is possible. So says Rebbe, and for what reason did the sages say she is not betrothed in all of these cases? Even though by Torah law it might work in some of the cases, by rabbinic decree it doesn't work in any of them. Why? Due to enmity. Enmity. What does this mean? Giving betrothal to a married woman that will take effect after her husband dies can engender enmity between the woman and her husband. I mean, in other words, she's married now to some guy and she doesn't like him. Okay, she's not going to divorce him, but she, agrees with some other guy. Listen, when my husband dies, I'll marry you. I'm taking away my own free agency, that when I finally am free of him, then I can choose who I'm going to marry. I'm going to say, the woman says, I'll marry you. Not until my husband dies, but yes, once my husband dies, I'll marry you. We don't allow this because in the meantime, now that she's got this future betrothal kind of locked in, what kind of relationship or what kind of effect is that going to have on her current relationship with her husband? Yeah, I think the sages were pretty wise here to prohibit this. Likewise, if a man says to his sister-in-law, yeah, I'll marry you after my wife dies, I mean, again, what effect will that have on the relationship with his wife? And also between the sisters. All of this smells bad, does not pass the smell test. And the sages said, no, you cannot create such a betrothal. So the Gemara asks, and let us also count Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, usually known as Rebbe, among those who maintain that a person can acquire an entity that has not yet come into the world. Since he said by Torah law, at least some of these cases do work, but by rabbinic decree we don't allow it because of the policy consideration that it will create enmity. So it would seem that Rebbe does agree that you can make a transfer or an acquisition of an entity that does not yet exist. And the reason the reason that this is a question, right, and not just a statement, is that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi is merely called Rebbe above. So the Gemara answers, right, well, Rebbe is Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. It's the same person, and you can rely on that. And the Gemara asks, and let us also count Rabbi Akiva, as it is taught among those who can say you can acquire something that does not yet exist. As it is taught in a Mishna, in Tractate Nedarim, page 85a, if a woman stated a vow for her husband, I will not produce anything for you, right? She vows that whatever she produces, whatever work she does, will be off limits to her husband, right? So it's a vow where she says that the production of my hands. And it doesn't have to be spelled out with the hands, but that language will enter this discussion. But she says, anything that I produce or the products of my hands will be konam to you. That is like saying, either she could say, anything that I make is consecrated, right? So anything that I bake, anything that, I make at my profession, let's say she's a skilled, highly skilled accountant, and so the product of her labor as an accountant, all of it will be consecrated, right? It will have to be given to the temple. She cannot make that vow because by Jewish law, the product of a woman's hands, of a wife's hands, belongs to her husband. And this is in exchange for his obligation to sustain her, whether she's productive or not. When he married her, he undertook that for the lifetime of their marriage, he has to sustain her. Now, they can make an agreement that he doesn't have to sustain her because she makes more money than him, in which case she can keep whatever she makes. But unless they make that agreement, she can't make a vow to consecrate all the work of her hands. And she also can't make a konam vow. Konam is saying that the fruit of my labor is as if it was consecrated. If it was consecrated, he couldn't benefit from any of it, right? Because it's me'ilah, misuse of something that is sacred because she consecrated it. And konam means it's as if I consecrated it. I'm not consecrating it. I'm going to keep it, or I'm going to do something else with it, but I've made a vow that my husband will not enjoy any of the fruit of my labor. That vow is a prohibited vow because it would contradict the law that says that the fruit of her labor belongs to her husband in exchange for his obligation to sustain her. Right? So, Rabbi Kiva says in a Mishna, if a woman stated a vow to her husband, I will not produce anything for you, including the work that she is obligated to do for him according to the terms of her marriage contract, because it is konam, i.e. forbidden like a consecration. So then her husband need not nullify her vow, right? A husband has the authority to nullify his wife's vows, which usually is understood to be a leniency for her because people make vows, when they're emotional, they'd rather not, they wish they hadn't made the vow. If a man makes such a vow, he has to go find a halakhic authority who can, unwind the vow for him. And until then, he's stuck with it. a woman can go to her husband and he can nullify her vow for her. But if he doesn't nullify it, if he's silent on the day that he hears that she made the vow, then she's in the same position that he's in. She would have to find a halakhic authority to nullify her vow for her. But regarding this idea that if she says all the fruit of my labor is konam to you, my husband, he doesn't even have to nullify it because that vow automatically is annulled. It's as if she said nothing because she doesn't have the right to consecrate or render konam the fruit of her labor, since legally it belongs to her husband. Rabbi Akiva says, nevertheless, even though the husband doesn't need to nullify it because her vow is not a vow, nevertheless, he should nullify her vow. Why? Because she will exceed the required amount of work and do more for him than is fitting for him to receive. If she does more than the fixed amount of work that a woman is obligated to perform for her husband, if she's a big earner and she could do a lot more than just, satisfy his needs, then, the excess would normally belong to the husband. But now that she said it's konam, what he needs, kind of the standard output of a wife, that she cannot consecrate or render konam. But beyond that, she can, right? So it would be in his interest to nullify her vow. Moreover, if she makes this vow and he doesn't nullify it, okay, so, her output while they're married, still is his. But if they divorce and then they decide to remarry again, her vow, once she is divorced, will go into effect. And anything that she, produces can't go to the benefit of this man who's now her ex-husband. And if they decide to remarry, that vow is still valid, and then he would not be able to benefit from any of her labor. And the Gemara rejects this suggestion. But wasn't it already stated with regard to this ruling that Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua, says, this is referring to a woman who says, let my hands be sanctified to their maker. It's not that she says that the product of her hands, the produce, the fruit of her labor is prohibited to her husband. Rather, she says, my hands are sanctified, and these hands exist in the world, therefore the vow can take effect, as I've just mentioned what the issue would be, beyond what is good for the husband, or if they divorce and then seek to remarry. But the question we've been asking is, this work doesn't exist yet, right? She's talking about work that she will produce in the future. That's the issue at hand. Can you make a vow regarding something that doesn't exist yet? No. She can't sanctify future work in that way, but she can say the fruit of these hands, right? Her hands exist, even though the work that she will create with them hasn't been created yet. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 5. Here's Mishnah number 6 here in chapter 3. With regard to one who says to a woman, you are hereby betrothed to me on the condition that I will speak in your favor to the authorities. For example, to help her address some legal matter, or on the condition that I will act for you as a laborer. If he spoke in her favor to the authorities, or he acted for her as a laborer, she is betrothed. But if not, she is not betrothed. So it sounds like he could offer to do a service for her, right? Either get some legal matter taken care of for her. He's essentially acting for her as a lawyer, like an advocate to deal with the government or some other authority, or he literally does labor for her. He mows her lawn, he cleans out the garage, he builds a new garage. So is the value of that labor, is he able to use that as the item of monetary value to be given to her to create, the symbolic exchange that enables betrothal or not? We know that if we're going to, as opposed to using a document or marital relations, if somebody's going to give money or the equivalent of money, the minimum amount is just 1 peruta, but something has to be given for this exchange, for the betrothal to take effect. So it sounds like when he says on the condition that I will, that I will represent you to the government, or that I will perform labor for you. He says on the condition, not in exchange for, but on the condition that I will perform these services. that the betrothal takes effect. So it sounds like he's trading the value of those services, or giving her the value of those services to create betrothal. But as we'll see, the Gemara says, no. He didn't say in exchange for the services. He said on the condition that I perform the services. So what's really going on here is that he says, be betrothed to me with this peruta of money that I'm giving you on the condition that I will perform these services. Right? So he's adding a condition to a betrothal that's being performed with some other item of value. So the services are not the value that he's giving her. The services are just a condition that they added to the betrothal, and which he's going to have to meet in order for the betrothal to take effect. Okay, that's the Mishnah, with a little explanation from me, foreshadowing the Gemara. Here's the Gemara. Reish Lakish says, and this halacha, this law, applies only if he gave her an item worth 1 peruta at the time of the betrothal. She is not betrothed via his recommendation to the authorities or via the work he does for her as a laborer, as these are merely conditions appended to the betrothal. The Gemara asks, and is she not betrothed by the monetary value of his recommendation to the authorities or his action as a laborer? But isn't it taught in a baraisa that if one says to a woman, you are hereby betrothed to me, by the monetary value you received when I gave you a ride on a donkey, or by the monetary value that you received when I gave you a ride in a wagon, or by the monetary value that you received when I had you ride in a boat, she is not betrothed. Well, how is this a proof that it wasn't by the value of peruta that she was betrothed in our Mishnah, but rather by the value of him representing her to the government or performing some action as a laborer? Answer, because the baraisa that I'm reading to you, what I just said is, be betrothed to me with the monetary value that you received when you rode on my donkey or in my wagon, etc. She already got that. And now he's seeking to create a betrothal based on something he gave her in the past without tying it to a betrothal. That's why it doesn't work. But if he says, be betrothed to me with the value I'm providing to you when you will ride on my donkey, and then she takes the ride on the donkey, then there would be a betrothal. Right? But if he says, by the monetary value you will receive when I will give you a ride on the donkey, or by the monetary value you will receive when I will give you a ride in the wagon, or by the monetary value you will receive when I will give you a ride in a boat, she is betrothed. And if you would say that here too, it is referring to a case where he gave her an item worth 1 peruta, and then this other stuff was just a condition, but the baraisa says, be betrothed to me by the monetary value you will receive when I give you a ride on my donkey, my wagon, or my boat. And furthermore, it is taught in a baraisa that if a woman says to a man, sit together with me, and I will be betrothed to you, or perform entertainment in front of me, or dance before me, or perform work for me like this layer of a building, I guess a bricklayer who's making a building, perform labor for me like him, and I will be betrothed to you. So in that case, the court appraises the monetary value of the action that she asked the man to perform. And if the action he performs for her is worth at least 1 peruta, then she is betrothed. So in other words, we appraise it and make sure it's worth at least 1 peruta, but he can perform a service for her, giving her that value where they both, he and she, understand that he is giving her a service worth some amount of money as the item of monetary value that he is obligated to give her in order to create betrothal. And so a service can work in the same way that some other item can work. And if you would say that here too, in these cases, it is referring to a case where he gave her an item worth 1 peruta, and the betrothal is with that rather than with these services, but the baraisa says that the court appraises the service that he performed for her, or the action that she asked him to take. If this were merely a condition, there would be no need for the court to make an appraisal. So isn't this a conclusive refutation of the opinion of Reish Lakish? And the Gemara answers that Reish Lakish could have said to you, this Tana, the rabbi of the Baraisa, maintains that the obligation to pay a person's wage is incurred only at the end of the period for which he was hired. Consequently, she is betrothed via money rather than by a loan, right? The guy's performing the service, but she doesn't owe him anything until he's finished performing it. At that point, she owes him the full value of the service performed, and then he can forgive that payment that he's owed, and that is what would create the betrothal. That's if wages only come due once the work is fully performed. But we've had this discussion in the last tractate. If wages become due along the way, right? If you're promised a full day's work and you only do 1 hour, are you owed an hour's worth of wages, like prorated over what you would have been paid if you worked the whole day, or you're not owed anything until you finish the whole day's work? Right? So Reish Lakish could have said the Tana of Baraisa maintains that the obligation to pay a person's wage is incurred only at the end of the period. Consequently, she's betrothed via the money owed at the end of that work period. But the Tana of our Mishna maintains that the obligation to pay a wage is incurred continuously from the beginning of the period he was hired and to its end. Since the debt accumulates throughout the duration that the service is performed, by the time he has finished the work, she owes him the entire sum, and a debt cannot be used for a betrothal. Like she's been accumulating debt in the past before the betrothal actually cuts on the table, and you cannot use a debt that was incurred earlier, not for the purpose of betrothal, and forgive it as the betrothal, right? You only can use something that is exchanged at the time of betrothal. The Gemara asks, and what forces Reish Lakish to establish the Mishnah in accordance with the opinion that the obligation to pay a wage is incurred continuously from the beginning of the period that he was hired and to its end, and that it is referring to a case where he gave her the value of 1 peruta? Why does he reject the possibility that the Mishnah is referring to one who did not give an extra peruta, and instead he betrothed her with the value of the service he performed in accordance with the opinion that the obligation to pay a person's wage is incurred only at the end of the period for which he was hired? And the Gemara replies, Rava said that the Mishnah was difficult for Reish Lakish. And why does the Tana specifically teach on the condition? Let him teach by the monetary value, as stated in the Baraisa. So rather conclude from it that any statement of on the condition is referring to a stipulation, and therefore the Mishnah must be dealing with a case where he has already given her the value of 1 peruta, right? Our Mishnah is not talking about somebody who said, be betrothed to me by the value of this service I will perform in representing you before the government or performing labor for you. Rather, be betrothed to me with 1 peruta, and on the condition that I will do these other services. The betrothal is based on the peruta, but it will not come into being until the condition is also met. Not because of its monetary value, but because they added a condition to the betrothal. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 6. Here's Mishnah number 7 of chapter 3. With regard to one who betroths a woman and says to her that the betrothal is on the condition that my father will approve this betrothal. If his father approves it, she is betrothed. But if not, she is not betrothed. If the father dies, she is betrothed, despite the fact that he never revealed whether he approved or not. If the son dies, one instructs his father to say that he does not want the betrothal, so that the betrothal will never have taken effect, thereby enabling her to avoid the requirement of levirate marriage, right? Because he was betrothed to her and he didn't have children because they never fully married. Maybe he left a brother, and then she would have a yibum obligation to the brother-in-law. Right, so very interesting. If the guy says, okay, be betrothed to me, and here's some item of money, right? Let's say the peruta, but also on the condition that my father will approve, right? So then that's a valid condition. If the father approves, they're betrothed. The father doesn't approve, not betrothed. If the father dies before he approves or disapproves, then we assume he approved. And if the son dies before the father approves or disapproves, then we tell the father to disapprove so that she doesn't have a yibum obligation. That was Mishnah number 7. Gemara, what is the meaning of on the condition that my father will want this betrothal, will approve this betrothal? If we say it means that they are not married until his father says yes, indicating his agreement, then say the middle clause of the Mishnah, if the father dies, she is betrothed. But how can she be betrothed? After all, he did not say yes. He did not show his approval, and the condition was not fulfilled. Rather, the phrase, on the condition that my father wants this betrothal, means on the condition that my father will remain silent and will not object when he hears of the betrothal. But if this is the case, then the last clause of the Mishnah is difficult. When the Mishnah said if the son died, one instructs the father to say that he does not want the betrothal. Why should this matter? After all, he remained silent when he first heard about it. Clearly, his mere silence does not constitute agreement. Rather, one must say that the phrase, on the condition that my father wants this betrothal, means that he said to her, on the condition that my father will not object to this betrothal at any point in time. So the Gemara asks, well, wouldn't this mean that the first clause of the Mishnah describes one reason, i.e. one set of circumstances, and the middle clause and the last clause describe a different set of circumstances? So Rabbi Yanai said, yes, this is so. And Reish Lakish said, conclude from this statement that according to the opinion of Rabbi Yanai, one forces a Mishnah to be explained as following two reasons, and in accordance with the opinion of one Tana, rather than establishing a Mishnah as following the opinions of two Tanaim and one reason. Right? Very interesting. You might say that if a Mishnah, when you think it through, would actually produce two different results, where either the father has to, overtly express that he approves, or a father really just needs to remain silent and not object, that if we need those two things to work for the Mishnah, to operate, then we would rather say that we're talking about two different conditions rather than to say that rather than to say that this Mishnah was formulated by two different rabbis who have different opinions. We'd rather say, no, we're talking about two different situations. Rav Yosef Bar Ami said, actually, the entire Mishnah is addressing one reason, i.e. one case. And what is the meaning of on the condition that my father wants the betrothal? It means on the condition that my father will not object from now and until 30 days have elapsed. His silence for 30 days indicates his acceptance of the betrothal. As in all situations, if you're going to create a betrothal and you're going to make a contingent on, some other factor, be super clear what you mean. Right? And make sure you consult your local Orthodox rabbi and make sure that the condition you want to add to the situation is a legal condition, is a legally valid condition. That was Mishnah number 7. Mishnah number 8 here in chapter 3. With regard to a man who said, I betrothed my minor daughter to someone, but I do not know to whom I betrothed her. And one man came forward and said, I betrothed her. His claim is deemed credible. If two men step forward, and this one said I betrothed her, and that one said I betrothed her, well then they must both give her a bill of divorce, a get, in order to render her permitted to go marry someone else besides these two guys. Since we're uncertain which one she's betrothed to, both of them have to give her a get so that we know that whichever one might have betrothed her, that betrothal has been terminated and she's free to marry whoever she wants. And if these two guys so desire, one of them gives her a get and the other one may marry her. That's Mishnah number 8. Now the Gemara. Rav says, when the Mishnah states that the claim of one who says that he betrothed the girl is deemed credible, where the father doesn't remember, he says, I know I betrothed her to someone, but I'm not sure who I betrothed her to. Thanks, Dad. So when this guy steps forward and says, well, you betrothed her to me, and we say that the claim of one who says that he betrothed this girl is deemed credible. It means that he is deemed credible to the extent that he may give her. And by the way, why are we talking about a girl and not a woman? Because the father betrothed her. The father can only betroth her while she's a girl. When she's a woman, the father doesn't betroth her. She betroths herself. And presumably, she would remember to whom she betrothed herself. So that's why we're talking about the case where the father betrothed her while she's still a girl. So this guy who comes forward and says, you don't remember who you betrothed her to, but I'm telling you it's me. So he is deemed credible to the extent that he may give her a get. Right? He's the one who said, okay, yeah, you betrothed her to me, so good. Now, please give her a get so that we can unwind this whole thing and she can be free to marry who she wants. But he is not deemed credible to step forward and say, you betrothed her to me, in order that he now can marry her. Right? Why don't we believe him? Because he could be biased. He really is into her, and he might actually tell a lie in order to become the one who gets a chance to marry her. He is deemed credible to give her a get, as there is a presumption that a person sins only for his own benefit, right? To step forward and say, you betrothed her to me so that he can give her the get and then she can go free, we would believe him because he's not, what good is he doing for himself other than being the good guy that steps forward and allows her to go free, right? So there's a presumption that people only sin for their own benefit. No one is suspected of sinning when he does not stand to gain from it, right? Where we have a presumption of suspicion, right? We don't have a presumption of suspicion when somebody is doing something that would basically be altruistic or basically based in truth. No one is suspected of sinning when he does not stand to gain from it. Since he is not allowed to marry her himself, we do not say that he lied without purpose. Why is he not allowed to marry her himself? Because in this situation where the father doesn't remember, he's not allowed to marry her if he steps forward and say, you betrothed her to me. He's not allowed. He has to give her the get. Now, she can later marry this guy, but it's going to be up to her. We're not going to base that, continuing on to marriage from the betrothal of this uncertain betrothal that the father can't remember. Since he is not allowed to marry her himself, we do not say that he lied without purpose. But he is not deemed credible to marry her, as we say that his inclination might have overcome him, leading him to falsely claim that he is the one who betrothed her. Rav Asi disagrees with Rav's interpretation of the Mishnah. And Rav Asi says, this guy is deemed credible, even to marry her, as he would not dare to lie directly to the father of the girl he claims to have betrothed. And Rav Asi concedes in the case of a woman who says, I became betrothed, but I do not know to whom I became betrothed. And one man came and said, I betrothed her, that this man is not deemed credible to marry her, because in this situation, she might have agreed to collude with him, as the Gemara will explain. The Gemara raises a difficulty. We learned in the Mishnah that if they so desire, one of the two men gives her a get, and the other one may marry her. And this is apparently a conclusive refutation of the opinion of Rav, who says that he may not marry her. And the Gemara answers, Rav could have said to you, there in our Mishnah it is different, since there is another person with him, also claiming to have betrothed her, and so he is afraid to lie. And so the Gemara comments, it is taught in a Baraisa in accordance with the opinion of Rav Asi. If a man said, I betrothed my daughter to someone, but I do not know to whom I betrothed her, and one person came forward and said, I betrothed her, he is deemed credible even to marry her. If that person married her, and then another man came forward and said, it was I who betrothed her, it is not within the second man's power to prohibit her to her husband. What's done is done. The Baraisa cites another case with regard to a woman who said, I became betrothed, but I do not know. Now, in all these cases, remember that a woman does not marry against her will. They're just talking about, was a betrothal created? If a valid betrothal was created and then she wants to marry the guy, she can marry the guy and not fear that there was some other betrothal hanging over her head. No one ever gets married against their will. Now, with regard to a woman who said, I became betrothed, but I do not know to whom I became betrothed, and one man came and said, I betrothed her, he is not deemed credible to marry her. Why not? Because she is protecting him. Perhaps she decided only now that she wants to marry him. and is therefore identifying him as the man who betrothed her, although she knows it was someone else. And the same suspicions do not arise in the case of a father who has no inclinations in this regard. Maybe. A dilemma was raised before the sages in the case of, right, because the father could want, I want this son-in-law, not that son-in-law. It seems like an issue, but discussion goes on. A dilemma was raised before the sages in the case of the Mishna, where the father claims to have betrothed his daughter to someone. What is the law with regard to stoning based on the father's account? Right, so if a woman is betrothed to a man, and before they get married or after they get married, she goes and sleeps with some other man, a Jewish man, then she's committed adultery. And if there's witnesses to the adultery that she committed, that's a death penalty offense, right? She's liable to death by stoning. I don't know if a woman was ever stoned for committing adultery. Remember that, when capital, death penalty cases were heard by the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem, it was understood that if a court executed a defendant once every 70 years, right? If it happened more than once in 70 years, I think even once in 70 years, then that court was labeled a murderous court. That's how rare the imposition of a death penalty was. And that's really something to think about, because what they didn't have is imprisonment, right? So it was like somebody might have been guilty of a death penalty offense, and the court was so reticent to hand out a death penalty, and then it didn't have the lesser punishment of life in prison, like we do. And still, they wouldn't hand out that death penalty. It was so rare. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Now, here what we're talking about is legal liability, not whether as a practical matter it's going to happen. And even with terms of legal liability, you'll see how rare it is. Right? So dilemma was raised. In the case of the Mishna where the father claims to have betrothed his daughter to someone, what is the law with regard to stoning based on the father's account? Right? So if we know that she slept with some guy who is not the person she was betrothed to, and that's provable, witnesses, etc., so she would be liable to the death penalty by stoning. But that's only the case if she was actually betrothed. What if there's witnesses to her sleeping with that other guy, but we're a little bit uncertain of whether the betrothal was created, right? Like, we're not witnesses to the betrothal. There's only the father who said, well, yeah, I betrothed her to so-and-so. She's betrothed. Do we say that based on the father, and maybe the father didn't know when they asked him, that if he says, yeah, she was betrothed, then they say, oh, well, your daughter committed adultery and now she's liable to the death penalty by stoning. They couldn't tell him that first. That's what father's going to say. But do we say that now that we've firmly established that, she had the sexual relations with that other guy, and now we need the father's testimony, and only the father's testimony, that she actually was betrothed, is the father's testimony enough to say, yes, she was betrothed, and therefore liable to the death penalty? That's the question being asked now. So Rav says the court in such a situation does not stone her. We don't accept the father's testimony alone that she was betrothed. And Rav Asi says we do. If the father says he betrothed his daughter, we accept that, and therefore, since she also had sexual relations with that guy in front of witnesses, she's liable to the death penalty. Now the Gemara elaborates on this dispute. Rav said that the court does not stone her. Why? Because when the merciful one deems the father credible, when he says that he betrothed his daughter, this is referring only to the prohibition against her marrying someone else without getting a get first. By contrast, with regard to imposing the death penalty on her, the Torah did not deem the father credible. We're not going to say that just because the father is deemed credible to say his daughter is betrothed and therefore she needs a get before she can go marry someone else, that we also deem the father credible to say she was betrothed, when the consequences of that are going to be that she's liable to the death penalty. Now, Rav Asi says, the court does stone her, does impose a death penalty. Why? Because the merciful one deems the father credible with regard to all matters pertaining to the betrothal of his minor daughter. Rav Asi says, and I concede, that in the case of a woman who says, I became betrothed, that the court does not stone her on the basis of her own admission, because you can't testify against yourself. Why? Because you can't, neither can your father or any relative come and be a witness against you in a capital case, and that includes you. The father is deemed credible in this because he's not testifying that she had sexual relations with a man that's not her husband. He's simply establishing that she was betrothed. But, interesting, she's not deemed credible to establish that about herself. And Rav Asi, and perhaps because of what we said before, that she, might twist who she was betrothed to in order just to get a different husband. Now, Rav Asi says, these laws of mine are roof breakers. Right? Rav Asi says, well, this has to be the law, but it can't be right. I just can't understand why I'm wrong. That's what Rav Asi is saying. These halachas of mine are roof breakers, i.e. they are difficult and incomprehensible. And Rav Asi explains, now, in a case where a father said, I've betrothed my daughter to someone, but I do not know to whom, where if someone came to marry her, this new guy is deemed credible and he may marry her, which means you say that the court then stones her on the basis of the father's testimony if she later commits adultery. Is it not logical that the court should stone her in a case where a woman said, I became betrothed, but I do not know to whom, thereby prohibiting herself to everyone to the extent that if someone came to marry her, he may not marry her? But that is not so, right? I.e. Rav Asi's rulings are in fact reasonable, and the merciful one deems credible a father who says that his daughter is betrothed, and therefore she can even be stoned, but the Torah did not deem her, i.e. the woman herself, credible in this regard. She does not receive a special degree of credibility, and although she can declare herself a forbidden item, i.e. she can render herself forbidden to all men, as far as punishment is concerned, her claim is treated by the court according with the regular rules of evidence. The father has special credibility to say that he betrothed or did not betroth his daughter to someone. And Rav Chisda said, and I'm very close to done, so if you've got questions or comments, please get them in. And Rav Chisda said, both in this case, when the father says, I betrothed my daughter, and in that case, when she herself says, I became betrothed, neither case, in both cases, the court does not stone her. There is no death penalty based on establishing that she was betrothed by her testimony or her father's testimony. Presumably, we could establish that she was betrothed in the presence of witnesses. Okay, well, then she was betrothed. And if we also establish by witnesses that she had sexual relations with a man not her husband, then she's got a serious problem. But if we can only establish the betrothal based on her own testimony or her father's testimony, we don't establish the betrothal in a death penalty case. We would establish it to prevent her from marrying anyone else until she receives a get from this guy, but only for that. And Rav Chisda follows his standard line of reasoning, as Rav Chisda says that if a father declared, this son of mine is 9 years and 1 day old, or this daughter of mine is 3 years and 1 day old, and the son engaged in intercourse with a woman forbidden to him, or the daughter engaged in intercourse with a man forbidden to her, he is deemed credible concerning his children's ages with regard to the requirement for the adult to bring an offering if they performed an act unwittingly, but not with regard to the receiving punishment of lashes and not with regard to other punishments. When this kind of thing comes up, it's very difficult. Like, what? Are you saying that the Talmud allows a boy of 9 years old to have sex with an adult woman or a girl of 3 years old to have sex with an adult man? No. What they're saying is if a rape happened, then it's because sex happened. And if they're younger than that, it's rape, but this child is considered never to have had this action at all, right? The one who did it is still punished for rape, and that is a death penalty offense. But we're talking about just legal definitions of certain terms, right? And that's a topic for another day. Here, what we're just talking about is a father believed to say that his son or daughter did or did not do such and such a thing? So the Gemara comments, it is taught in a Baraisa in accordance with the opinion of Rav Chisda that if one said, this son of mine is 13 years and 1 day old, or this daughter of mine is 12 years and 1 day old, right? The father's just testifying about the age. And these ages render one an adult with respect to being obligated in the commandments that an adult is obligated in. And the father is deemed credible concerning his testimony about the age of his children with regard to vows, i.e. any vow that they make is valid because they took that vow as an adult. If they're younger than the adult age, then their vows are not vows. And this is also valid, the father's testimony about the child's age is valid with regard to dedications, i.e. if the child, who's now an adult, consecrates an item by saying it should be dedicated to God. If he's an adult, it's valid. If he's a child, it's not. And the father is deemed credible to testify the child's age. Also with regard to consecrations and with regard to valuations. Vows to donate to the temple treasury a fixed valuation of oneself or others. In all these cases, their vows are valid if they are adults, and we believe the father who's testifying about the age of the child. But the father is not deemed credible if, as a result of his testimony, the child will receive lashes or other corporal punishments for transgressions that the child, now an adult, has committed. As the testimony of one witness, especially that of a family member, is insufficient for this purpose, right? So it's very interesting that you would need a witness, you need two witnesses to establish that the child did, let's say, the transgression that would result in lashes. And you would also need two witnesses to establish the age of the child, rendering him liable to receive that other punishment. And the testimony of the father by himself is not sufficient if the consequence of that is going to be corporal punishment. Okay, let's go to questions or comments. Joe, is there any length of time that limits him nullifying her vow? Yes. Example, if she makes a vow and if he, the husband or the father, before she's married, if she's still living in her father's house, for whatever reason doesn't negate it within 2 weeks, the time has passed for him to be able to do so. Yes and no. If he hears about it and he doesn't say anything on that day, then he can no longer nullify the vow. But if she took the vow and, she was in New York, and the father, the husband, is in LA, and he doesn't hear about the vow until 2 weeks later, and on the day that he hears of it, he nullifies it, then the vow is nullified, right? So it's not how much time has passed, it's when did the father or husband hear about it. Lucy, can the work he does for her not be considered to be a gift rather than creating a debt? Now you're talking about where he said, be betrothed to me for this peruta on the condition that I will perform this other labor or that I will represent you, in court, right? So that it's not I guess it is a gift actually, it is a gift, but it's a necessary gift in order for the betrothal to become a betrothal. Because it actually sounds like he's going to do that and not get paid. What we were asking is, what if he says, be betrothed to me by the monetary value of my representing you in court or of my, building a kitchen for you. Okay? So then we would assess, is that labor worth at least one peruta? It certainly would be. And now that should work, right? And then that question of whether his wages accrue while he's doing it or at the end, it seems to not matter because the sages said you can do that as long as the labor performed is worth that value. He is going to have to finish the labor that he promised. Now, what's interesting is, well, what if he doesn't finish it? But if the wage is accruing as he goes, does he have to finish it? Didn't he already give her some of the labor and, the value of that can be used to create the betrothal? But if he doesn't finish and the wages only become due when he finishes and he never finished, maybe there's not a betrothal. And I'm not sure what the answer to that question is. Tom, presumably then, any conditions appended to the payment of the peruta must be appropriate and performable by the man. Yes. Is betrothal therefore always by payment or something tangible rather than any service? No, right? No, I'm sure you asked that before, what we just said, and before we got to later in the day, right? Because you can do it by a service. You can. You can. But to avoid the problem, give her the dollar. Give her the dollar, create the betrothal based on that. You know, or these days, probably you would give her the ring, right? Some kind of a diamond ring or something worth far more than a peruta. That, you know, we all say, well, why should love be tied to money at all? And yet, you know, people do give nice engagement rings even now. An engagement ring is certainly, you know, it would work if you were trying to create betrothal based on that. Now, what's interesting about this whole body of law is that we don't actually practice this. We don't create betrothal and then a year later get married. Engagement in secular culture is not at all the same as betrothal. As we've mentioned many times, betrothal, once you're betrothed, you can't break it off without getting a divorce. Even though you're not fully married, to break off betrothal requires a divorce. You know, in our culture, when people get engaged, if they break off the engagement, they're done, right? They had no other legal obligations to each other, so it's very different. That's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Wednesday, at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a good night.